Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with Dr. Andrew Loke. We're going to be talking about the book that him and Kenneth Sparks and William Lane Craig and Marcus Ross did together, a little debate book on the historical Adam, the questions surrounding that. How are you doing today, Dr. Loke?
I'm doing well. Thank you for inviting me to your show.
Awesome.
And hi,
So,
everyone. Yeah.
of course, my audience is probably aware that I did another interview with Dr. Ross on this very book. So, this will be just a little bit of interaction with that, but also with a lot of other things that were happening in the book. So, this should be a lot of fun.
Yeah.
So, first, I just want to start out with just your view. Some people might not be familiar with your view. Could you give us your 5-10 minute summary of the arguments and evidence that you present?
Sure. Well, thank you. Can you show the slides?
Yes, I can. All right.
Yeah, I think with the slides, it'll be clearer.
There you go.
So a lot of people today think that the scientific evidence for evolution and evolutionary population genetics contradict the Bible, right? And so my view is a response to this objection against the Bible.
Okay.
And as we address this objection, I think there are two key issues that we need to consider. One is how to interpret the scientific data, and the second is how to interpret the Bible. So I'll be focusing on the second issue, right, for the next few minutes.
Mhm.
Next slide, please. So when we think about how to interpret the Bible, we need to consider the genre, the context, the meaning of the words in the original language, the grammar, and the background and concerns of the authors. Right. So in this case, you need to consider the ancient Jewish background, and we should be very careful not to interpret the Bible in accordance with our modern scientific knowledge. Right.
Hmm.
They'll be reading science, our modern science, into the text, and I think that is a bad way to interpret the Bible. Right? This is the era of concordism. Right? Rather, I think we should interpret the Bible according to the above mentioned considerations, right? The five considerations which I listed. Yeah, next slide, please. And we also need to distinguish between the following tasks, right? So the task of interpreting the Bible, I call this task A, and in distinction from task B, which is showing that the biblical account is true, or showing that any model is true, right? So that is distinct, right, from interpreting the Bible, and which is also distinct from task C, which is showing that there is no contradiction, no incompatibility between, say, evolution and the Bible. Okay, so we need to note the difference between saying that the Bible teaches evolution or Big Bang, uh, in contrast with saying that the Bible does not contradict the evolution or Big Bang, for example, right? So these are two different statements. Okay, so I'm focusing on this. So when I present my model later on, I'm focusing on the
Mhm.
second issue, right? In accordance with task C. And for task C, it is legitimate to suggest a possible model and say, for all we know, that might have been what happened, right? And this possible model may not be something that the human biblical authors are aware of, right? Because God didn't reveal to them everything, right? Obviously, God
Mhm.
didn't tell them about quantum physics, or cosmology, or whatever. So we shouldn't expect the biblical authors to tell us everything. So there's a lot of things that they don't know. And so I think, no, when we suggest a possible model, that is okay, right? And as long as the model doesn't contradict what they actually said in the text. Okay.
Mhm.
All right, next slide. Okay, so let me say something more about task A first, about interpreting the text first, right? Before I talk about task C, right? Before I talk about presenting a possible model. Okay, so because we need to get the biblical data correct first, right? We need to
Okay.
interpret the data correctly first. Okay, so for task A, now first of all, we need to consider the genre, and the different scholars have different views. My own view is that it's a complex interweaving of genres, right? There's poetry, hymn, and doctrine in narrative mode. But it's interesting to note that there are genealogies in Genesis 1 to 11. So this indicates an interest in chronology and a causal explanation. Right, there's a causal explanation of a sequence of events, how the
Mhm.
present generation of people came from earlier generation. And so by putting Adam into the list, the authors of scriptures are treating him as a historical person, right, who caused the subsequent generations. And moreover, the New Testament authors, such as the Apostle Paul and uh, Luke, they also regarded Adam as a historical person. right? No, we don't have time to go into the exegesis of the relevant text, but I think this is pretty obvious to everyone, including all four of us, right? In the book, right? Even Kenton Sparks, Marcus Ross, Craig, and myself, we all agree, right, on this point. Okay, so I don't think we need to spend much time
Right.
on this point. Okay, so next slide. Now, concerning the interpretation of Genesis, the days of creation, right? In the Four Views book, I basically defend John Collins' view. Right? John Collins is an eminent Old Testament scholar, and he argues that Genesis 1:1 describes the initial bringing into existence of all things. Verse 2 gives the condition under which the first day began in verse 3. And he argues that the passage does not exclude a gap of duration between verse 1 and verse 2. And moreover, he argues that the 6 days are analogical. Okay, and they refer to God's activity of shaping physical reality to provide a suitable place for humankind to live, to love, and to serve. All right, so yeah, given this view, one doesn't have to hold on to a young creationist view, right? Okay, next. Now, a lot of people today think that evolution is contrary to what the Bible says about according to their kinds, but actually, when we read in the Hebrew, right, Richard Hess points out that the original Hebrew lamin, right, can be understood as saying that God created various kinds of cattle, creeping things, etc., without asserting or implying that each kind remain in their own kind, right? It doesn't imply fixed kinds, and therefore doesn't exclude the possibility that God could have allowed certain creatures of particular kind to evolve into another kind, so as to bring about various kinds of creatures which God has planned. Now, of course, I'm not saying that the Bible teaches that, right? But I'm saying that it doesn't exclude this, right, possibility. Okay, it doesn't exclude evolution. I mean, this phrase, according to their kinds, it doesn't exclude evolution. All right, next slide. And then the Hebrew words asa and yasa, which describes God's forming of embryos in the womb. Okay, as we know, the formation of embryos in the womb is a process that took time, right? It's not immediate. Okay, and this same Hebrew words are also used to describe God's forming of the human species. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says yasa, right? Then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground. The Hebrew word is yasa. And so the use of these words implies, or at least does not rule out, that God's forming of humankind was a process and not an instantaneous event. Next. And the other thing we need to note is that the image of God, what does it mean? Okay, so it refers to the election of Adam and his descendants by God for the function of royal representatives, that is, to represent God and to exercise a kind of dominion that could extend to the whole world over other kinds of creatures, and a sense of responsibility towards the Creator God and other creatures for this kind of dominion. And also in the New Testament, where we read about the image of God, right, it refers to being conformable to Christ, the image to Christ. Okay, and Acts chapter 17, verse 26, it says, "From one he made all nations to inhabit the whole earth." I interpret this to imply that before the 1st century AD, where this verse was stated in Acts, people of different nations were already descendants of one. Okay, so what this means is that from Adam, right, it has already spread to different nations. And so this provides reason for thinking that all people of different nations today are human beings, right, who are descendants of Adam and who bear the image of God. Okay, so given all these observations, I agree with Pope Pius, who is a previous pope, right, of the Catholic Church, and he says that the Catholic Church does not forbid that, with regards to in conformity with the present state of human science and sacred theology, that take place with regards to the doctrine of evolution, in as far as it inquires into the origin of the human body as coming from pre-existent and living matter. Okay, so the Pope says there's no problem with evolution, but as long as we affirm that the souls are immediately created by God. Okay, and so this view implies that the Catholic Church actually accept evolution, right? It's not a problem for the Catholics. So I have good friends who are Catholics. I have a friend who is a Dominican priest, and he's my colleague, right, in my university. And he often told me that he find it very strange how come a lot of evangelical Christians, fundamentalists, they have so much problems with evolution. For the Catholic Church, there's no problem. The Pope and the Catholic theologians already interpreted the Genesis text, and argue that the Bible is there's no conflict between the Bible and evolution. All right, next. Okay, and in my book, I provide a possible model in accordance with task C to show that there is no conflict, right? That there's no contradiction. And so so let me present a summary of my model. Okay, so this is a possible model which distinguishes between anatomical Homo possessing the image of God. Okay, I call this God's image bearers. And on my model, they are equivalent to human beings, right? So human beings refers to God's image bearers. Okay, so I distinguish human beings from anatomical Homo. Okay, so anatomical Homo, including Homo sapien, right? They are anatomical human, but they are not human beings, right? On my model. So on my model, God took a pre-existent anatomical Homo, or he could have created one de novo, and make him to be the first God's image bearer. That is, he'll be the first human being, right? And he's Adam, right? And the image of God was passed down from Adam to his descendants, and that all humans today have him as a common ancestor, even though they descended from a large population of anatomical Homo, as indicated by population genetics. Okay, so population genetics indicate that the present number of the present human beings, they came down from a large population, right? So my model is consistent with that. And some descendants of Adam could have mated with non-human anatomical Homo, who contributed to the genetic diversity, but their descendants were nevertheless fully human. Okay, so that is my model. Next slide.
So just for some clarity for people, so you're saying that this group that was made in the image of God, so that is either created like creation ex nihilo or a different way, not specific. It doesn't really matter for your view. It could be either or. But
Yes.
But you're saying is that when the text of like Genesis 1, it refers to like human beings, then you're referring to this group of people that's made in the image of God, and there might be another group of similar people that are like human beings, but
Anatomically similar.
anatomically similar, like so
Yeah,
physically similar, but the Genesis text when it said
behaviorally they may be very different, right? Behaviorally
behavior, okay,
and other capacities, right? In the spiritual capacities, moral
mm,
capacities, they could be qualitatively very different.
okay, and in that way, if we looked at the scientific record, we wouldn't really see much of a difference from a physical perspective, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Right. All right, so let's keep going.
Okay. And so, given my model implies that the existence of historical Adam is compatible with evolution biology. There's no contradiction. And on my view, I think that both the ancient GAE model and the recent GAE model are defensible possibilities, right? So I don't insist on the recent GAE model, even though I was assigned to defend this in the 4 Views book. Okay. But I myself don't limit myself to this. I think both are defensible. And I think that if someone claims that science has shown Adam does not exist, then the burden of proof will be on him or her to disprove both models.
Okay. And just somewhere here, so ancient GAE, that's genealogical Adam and Eve. And
Yes.
Could you explain that idea?
Yeah, so the distinction between ancient and recent is that on the recent view, Adam will be somebody who lived in the Neolithic era, right, around 10 or 12,000 years ago. Whereas an ancient model would say that Adam lived earlier than that.
Okay.
Okay, and finally, I want to address an issue which is that do all people, do they possess the image of God? Now, it is a fundamental premise of my model that all people today are indeed descendants of Adam, right? Because that is the data which I'm working with, right? That is task A, as I said earlier on. I interpret Acts chapter 16, Acts chapter 17, 26 as saying that all people today, all anatomical Homo today are descendants of Adam. Okay, and from a theological perspective, God has the power to ensure that this is true. And from a scientific perspective, this is perfectly compatible with science as well, because scientists have calculated that the answer to the question, how far back in time must we go to find an individual who was the ancestor of all present-day anatomical Homo humans, is surprisingly recent, right? It will just take a few thousand years, okay? And therefore, this indicates that all human beings today could have a very recent common ancestors, say just a few thousand years ago, right? Even if substantial forms of migration exist with a very even if substantial forms of population subdivision existed with a very low rate of migration. And again, I think the burden of proof might be on those who disagree to show otherwise. But I think that given this scientific conclusion about the most recent common ancestor, MRCA, I think that my model is very plausible. I think that is very is likely, right? It's not ad hoc at all.
Okay.
Okay, next. Yeah. So in conclusion, regardless of whether evolution is true or not, God exists. Right? There must still be a divine first cause who brought about the universe and all other things. Right? So I have defended the cosmological argument in my other books, and I think that so regardless whether evolution is true or not, God, there must be a God. And moreover, I think that the biblical account of how God created the world has not been refuted by the theory of evolution. And so this the remarkable resilience of biblical doctrines can be regarded as another evidence for their divine origins, right? So I think that this is another indication that despite the test of time, despite the progress of science, the Bible hasn't been refuted. Okay, so this provides additional evidence, in addition to other evidence such as the cosmological argument, resurrection argument, for thinking that Christian theism is true.
Okay.
Okay, I think that is my last slide. Yes.
Okay. All right. So a big thing that you wanted to stress there is that this is a possible model. So could you talk about that? Are you simply saying that you're not saying like, hey, this is the most likely thing. You're just saying that, hey, this is a possible thing that we should talk about in this discussion.
Now, I also want to clarify that, what you say is correct, but nevertheless, I also want to highlight that I think that my model is the most likely, based on what we know so far. Right?
Okay.
It is more likely than Kenton Sparks' model, which basically rejects Adam, right? I think that Kenton Sparks' view is wrong, given good reasons for biblical inerrancy, right? So I'm an evangelical myself, but even apart from that, right, I think that that there is good reason for thinking that the Bible is inerrant, right? Given that there is good historical evidence to think that Jesus is God and that Jesus himself affirmed that Adam exists, right? I think, and so I think that there is good reason, right, for thinking that there is a historical Adam, and therefore I think that the Sparks view is unlikely. And I think that my model is more likely than Craig's model. Why? Because Craig didn't consider Craig didn't take into consideration this awareness of God the Creator, right, by the first human, which I think is taught by the biblical text when the Bible talks about image of God, right, as I explained just now. But Craig, when he talks about humans, the characteristics that are sufficient condition for humanity, he just referred to some scientists, right, which talks about the capacity for abstract thinking and planning, etc. But he ignored what the Bible says about the image of God, which refers to being called by God, elected by God, right, to rule and subdue the world, right? So that implies an awareness of God the Creator. So when did this awareness start in?
I'm sorry for it's possible I'm not familiar with the word. You said it starts with an O, Uranus. That's what I'm hearing.
Awareness. AWARENESS. Aware.
Awareness. Okay, thank you. All right. Yes.
Yeah, awareness. Right.
Yeah.
Now, Craig thinks that Adam is a Homo heidelbergensis, right? But that is 700,000 years ago, right? And we don't have evidence of people worshiping God the Creator until just a few thousand years ago, right? So I think Craig's view, even though it's logically possible, I think that is a possible view, but I think that is quite unlikely actually. That for so long we don't have any signs at all, right, of people worshiping or being aware, right, of God the Creator. So I think that my model is more likely than Craig's model, and I also think that my model is more likely than Marcus Ross, right, because there are multiple independent, overwhelming scientific evidence against young Earth creationism. Okay, so given that this is the case, I think that there's good reason to think that all other models are false, or in Craig's case is unlikely, right? But I think that there's no good reason to think that my model is false or unlikely, and therefore, given that this is the case, I do think that my model is the most likely model, and it is not ad hoc, right? Because as I said just now, for my premises, right, I actually appeal to biblical exegesis, scientific data, like say for example, considering MRCA, right, the most recent common ancestor, which has been, this is something that scientists have established, and so that I think that my model is actually the most plausible, actually. But having said that, right, as I said earlier on, to argue that there's no contradiction, all I need to do is to show that there is no that it is possible, right? That's all I need to argue for. Right? Yeah, and to think about likelihood or probability, I think that will be confounding task B with task C, right? Task B is about showing something is true, but I don't have to do that, right? Even though I do think that my model is more likely, right, compared to the others.
Okay, awesome. All right, so so you do think it's the most likely, but what you're essentially saying is, hey, you have the biblical text, and we should read that as it's saying what it's attempting to claim, and then we can also look at the scientific data, but those they're not necessarily commenting on the same thing. So therefore they would be possible. Both would be possible at the same time. They wouldn't contradict. That's basically what you're saying.
I take both to be true, actually. Right? I take the
Yeah.
Bible to be true,
Right.
and I take the scientific evidence to provide strong evidence for certain conclusions too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, with certain significant amount of likelihood, and I provide a possible model to show that there's no contradiction, right, between these two results.
Okay. Okay, I see. All right. Thank you. All right. So let's see here. Okay, so that answers the next question there. Okay. So people understand your position. Would you say that the biblical text allows for either a de novo creation of Adam, or God took a pre-existing anatomical homo? Could you explain how the Bible allows for both?
Yeah. So just now, as I explained, Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, I mentioned that the Hebrew word there, yatsar, right?
Yep.
It could mean a process, okay? And so, as the Catholic Church, as Pope Pius interpreted, right, he says that it could be it's consistent. There's no contradiction with an evolution process, right? Even though the Bible doesn't say that, but there's no contradiction with that. And so, I think that Bible does allow, right, for this process. But having said that, right, I'm not insisting that it must be a process, because I also think that it is possible that God just create Adam de novo, maybe using a very short process, but just directly from the dust, right? That's what that's what de novo means, right? That and my model is also compatible with that too, right? Because even if Adam is created de novo, it doesn't exclude the possibility that there could be already other anatomical homo outside the garden, who came by evolution, right? Who existed because of evolution process, and they then interbred with Adam's descendants, and that could account for the scientific data for evolution. So I think that both have no problems with science, and both views have no problem with the Bible too.
Okay, so you have Genesis 1, when it talks about the creation of humans, uses the word bara, and then you have Genesis 2, when it talks about the creation of Adam, it uses the word yetzar. So bara is kind of like usually translated create, and then yetzar is usually translated something like form or made. So could you talk about the Genesis 1? So would you say the same thing applies for that same Hebrew word? Is that what your argument is?
Genesis 1?
Yeah, Genesis 1 day 6, when it talks about the creation of humans. So you would say that could be either creation ex nihilo, out of nothing, or like a process.
Yeah. So yes, I think it could be both. Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Just making sure. Okay. Just want to make it abundantly clear. All right. So this is something that was really interesting, and we kind of talked back and forth. So in your chapter, you mentioned that the ancient Near Eastern genealogical lists found so far only include real people. You quote John Walton on this topic. And Kenneth Sparks' reply to you, he notes how the Assyrian kings list persons listed at the beginning of the list were tribal eponyms rather than actual people. In your reply, you mentioned that the Assyrian kings list is a king list, not a genealogical list. The reason why this discussion is important is because you want to say that, and other people in the book also want to say like, hey, because Genesis 5, because it's mentioned these genealogies,
Yeah.
it has a historical basis. And you mentioned John Walton because John Walton's like, hey, the only time we find genealogical lists is when they're trying to refer to historical people. So if we don't have any other examples, then Genesis 5 is probably doing it as well. I would assume that's the argument. So could you talk about why specifically a genealogical list is important? Like, what specifically about a genealogical list must mean that there must be a historical people in mind?
Okay, thank you for your question. Now, before I answer it, I want to begin with a caveat, a
Okay.
qualification, right? Which is that my argument for historical Adam
Hmm.
is not dependent on this point. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, because as I said just now, there are other texts which affirm a historical Adam, right?
Uh-huh.
So, for example, in the New Testament, it's very clear. And in fact, Kenton Sparks, who raised this objection, he himself ended up agreeing that the Bible does intend to say that there is a historical Adam, right? Even though he thinks that the Bible is wrong, right?
Hmm.
So he also think that the Bible does affirm a historical Adam. So the affirmation of historical Adam doesn't rest on this point about
I see.
genealogy, which
Okay.
Walton raised. Okay, and so I could be wrong, but that doesn't affect my
Okay.
conclusions, my model. Okay,
Right.
and okay, so let's start discussing this point. So as I said, I'm taking it from Walton, and basically Walton's point is that a genealogical list is intended to claim that a list of what the author of the list think
Hmm.
regarded as a real person. Okay,
Hmm.
I mean the author may be wrong, right? Or he may be right.
Uh-huh.
But in any case, the author, he regarded a person who is historical, and this person descended from other person whom he think is historical, right? So that is Walton's point about what a genealogical list is trying to function as.
Hmm.
Now, whereas a king's list, now a king's list can include genealogy, right? But it does not necessarily. But some of the kings that are listed, right, may not be descendants of other people, right? Because why?
Hmm.
Because um, you know some people may have usurped the throne, right? Overthrew the previous line of kings. Right?
Right.
And in that case, the new king was not a descendant from other kings because he overthrew the previous king, right? Or in some cases, the person may be directly appointed by the gods, according to the ancient ways of thinking. And yeah, a king's list may not necessarily convey the point that there must be some descent, although it could also include that as well, right? As I said. And so now you mentioned in your email discussion with me that Robert Wilson,
Hmm.
in his book about genealogy and history of biblical world,
Hmm.
he notes how each king in the list is viewed as a sort of as a son of his predecessor, even when this view is known to be historically inaccurate, and there is pseudo genealogies found in various ancient civilizations, right?
Hmm.
But I think that in those cases, those kings are regarded as real people, even though they may not truly be the son of another people. Okay, so when Wilson say that it is historical inaccurate, I think that what he means is that yeah, so no, a person Y who is claimed to be the son of X, well, actually he is not truly the son of X, but he is still a real person, right? So even though there's historical inaccuracy there, but they are still a real or somebody who is regarded as a real person who is being claimed here. Why and why? Because this is important because the reason why they claim that is because they want to claim some kind of le- legitimacy, right? To be
Hmm.
that to have a right to become king, right? Because
Right.
I'm the descendant of and so, right?
Right.
So if the author of the king's list or this kind of genealogies found in the king's list, if they think that the ancestors are mythological people, then that would defeat the purpose, right? Then where is the ground for legitimacy, right? In that case, right? And so yeah, and so that will be my response. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I don't want to spend too much time on this discussion specifically, but it's not fundamental
Mhm.
to your argument.
Yeah.
Um,
That's right.
so, so you say because the King's List it needs to be historical, or they need to at least think it's historical because that's kind of the legitimacy is relying on that. Um, uh,
Mm.
Basically, like, oh, we can basically they're saying, hey, we can trace the all the different kings and the ruling, and that's how we have our power today. Um,
Mm.
but um, so I think this is important. So when you talk about myth, which I would think that a lot of scholars at least do think that the king's lists
Sumerian
are,
kings list, yeah, mythical. Yeah.
yeah, mythical, as in they are not necessarily making strictly historical claims, even though they are saying, hey, can trace our kingship prior to this time period when they were writing, um, but at the same time those texts oftentimes have no problem changing the names or the order or just historical facts, and there's also mythical elements to the text, um, which the whole point being saying is the at least it seems to me, I'm not an expert on this topic, but it seems to me from what I've studied from scholars is that this is the King's List are mythical texts and that they are not strictly historical, but they are claiming something that is true, which is
Something that
that
they think that is something that they claim is true, right? Something
uh,
that they claim is true.
um,
Okay.
from a historical perspective or just a truth perspective. So like the what I would say is the
Yeah.
claim, the true claim is that they're claiming, hey, we essentially get our authority from the gods, and we can trace it back. But just because that list isn't completely literal historical doesn't mean that we can't trace it back. That it's almost like a metaphor in some ways. Are you following what am I saying? Am I making any sense?
Now, I think we have to be very careful here to distinguish what the author is trying to claim
Uh-huh.
with whether the claim is true or not, right?
Right. Sure.
So, in the case of the Sumerian kings list, I think that there is good reason to think that their claim is false, right? As many scholars will argue, that they are mythical because the kings that the list say are kings are actually not kings because if they were kings, that we will find more evidence of these people in other sources, but we don't find them. But again, this is an argument from silence, you can say, right? But many scholars think that that this is a good argument from silence,
Mm.
and so they think that this provides some reason for thinking that some of these kings are false. And moreover, in some other lists, right, there are also gods mentioned, right? So for example, in some of the Greek lists,
Mm.
they claim that they descended from the gods or whatever. And of course, many modern scholars would think that that is mythical, right?
Mm.
But then we should be careful to distinguish whether the claim is true or not with what they are trying to claim, right? For those
Mm.
people who are claiming that they descended from the gods, they may well believe that they did descend from the gods, right? Even though that claim is false, or likely false. Yeah. So we need to distinguish these two things, right? But when it comes to the Bible, okay, so my point from with citing those kings lists in other ancient Near Eastern texts is to say
Mm.
that, yeah, the Bible is also trying to claim that Adam exists and we descended from him, and the Bible is also trying to claim that Adam was created by God. And in this
Mm.
case, I do think that there is good reason for thinking that what the Bible is trying to claim is true, right? Given
Mm.
the other independent reasons for biblical inerrancy, right, which I mentioned earlier on, right? So yeah, so I think that so we need to distinguish these issues, right, about what the author is trying to claim and whether the claim is true or not. Yeah, we shouldn't
Mm.
confound them.
Yeah. Yeah. So for people curious, you could read this page. I'll later add the description. There's a online article. Well, it's not an article, but whatever. It's the Sumerian Kings list. People could read through it. It's a fun, possibly boring read. But
Yeah.
so just for clarity there. So
Mm.
I guess when I say the word myth, that might actually be different than other scholars. What they're saying is myth. I guess there's two types of it. There's one myth that it's like it's how people typically use it today, where that's not historical. There's
Mm.
no truth about it. Myth
Mm.
is like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, okay, compared to the myth that scholars use when they refer to like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish, where the purpose of the myth isn't necessarily claiming a historical event, but there's truth behind that. Kind of like the idea of like, uh, what is it, George Washington or Abraham Lincoln, whatever, chop down the cherry tree. The point of the story, and I guess for some people, is that it's claiming that he was an honest person. He was not a liar, even if that necessarily wasn't an historical event. So essentially what you're saying is that this writer of the Sumerian King List, or writers, that they are making historical claims, even though they're wrong, and that's how you.
They are making what they think is what they thought is
Yeah.
historical claims, right? What they thought.
Yeah. And I guess my understanding previously, although I don't claim to be a scholar, is that maybe they aren't necessarily making historical claims in regards to maybe they are, but what I'm saying is it's mythical in regards to the truth is, hey, we have this kingship and authority that comes down from a certain point a long time ago. Even if the words that we're using to describe it, the people we're describing with, the number of years that we're describing with, that you can see on the screen here, isn't necessarily literally historically true. That they weren't attempting to describe it literally and historically. But I mean, I'll let you, if you want to comment on anything else, that's okay. I don't want to spend too much time on it. So hopefully maybe sometime we'll have to have another conversation or something like that.
So and my point is that I think that those people who wrote those lists are intending to claim what they thought was, or what they are claiming as historical persons, in order to legitimize, right? The certain rights of some people. Okay, so when they use genealogies, they are intending to claim what they regarded as real people, descending from what they regarded as real people, in order to provide legitimacy, right? In that sense, and so that is why Walton argues that genealogical lists have included what people regarded as real people, because that is an important purpose of the genealogies. And so here, and so the point here is about what they are trying to claim, what the ancient people are trying to claim. And it's also important for us when we interpret the Bible to understand this point, because this can help us understand the genre, right? The genre of genealogical lists, which will provide us, which will help us to understand how the text would have been understood by the ancient readers, right? When they see such thing, right? They will understand that, okay, whoever guy wrote this is trying to claim that there is this list of real people, right? And we see further evidence of this with regards to the Bible, when we consider the reception history of the Bible. So how the Bible was received, how it was read by ancient people such as the New Testament authors, right? So as I said just now, the New Testament authors clearly understood Adam and the genealogy to be historical, right? So this is another additional evidence for indicating how the genealogies should be understood. They should be understood as trying to claim that there are real people descending from real people.
I see. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that explanation there. So I do have a super chat, actually. So I want to make sure I get that asked. So Nasir Kuros, he says, in the legend of the Jews, why does Adam bring a crocus from the garden? Why was the nard and Karkum construction and songs changed from the earlier good nard and saffron of Qumran 1 Enoch? It's okay if you're not familiar with this text. Maybe.
Yeah, that's right. I'm not familiar with this text, and in any case, it doesn't affect my argument, because this first Enoch and the Qumran text, this is not regarded as canonical, and I mean the Jews, whoever wrote this, right, could have added some details, flowery details. I mean, they agree that there's this guy Adam, but they added some more other flowery details into the story, right? So, but that doesn't deny that do agree that Adam exists.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Nasir, for your super chat. Really appreciate it. Thank you for supporting the channel. What I'll do in the comment section is maybe I'll do a little digging and see if I can find anything about that. But all right. So to continue here. So another really interesting thing there that Spark said was in Genesis 10. It's that's the table of essentially the nations. In this list it says that like essentially people descended from Noah one of their names was Egypt or Assyria, and so essentially it makes a family tree. But let's see here. So he in Genesis 10, I believe. So Ken Sparks, he mentioned that, and he basically is like, hey, the like them mentioning these nations is essentially like today saying, hey, my descendants were China or Australia or something like that. But that kind of sounds silly today because it's like, well, China and Australia, they were nations. They weren't they weren't actual people that the nation descended from. So basically, it's like for the Israelites to say that we came from people named Egypt and Assyria, or like their student, that's how they came to be about, would be a little silly. And you replied by saying, hey, he didn't mention Walton's explanation, which is that possibly the list considers these to be patronymic ancestors of those places. So could you talk about this view?
Okay, so first of all, I need to clarify that it's not silly, right, for the ancient people. Why? Because you know the Israelites, they came from Jacob, right? And Jacob was also named Israel, isn't it? Okay, so so Israel, of course, now we now know that Israel is the name of a nation, right? The nation of Israel. But then Jacob was also called Israel, right? So what this illustrate is patronym, right? So what patronym means is that there's a name or a component of a name that is based on a given name of one ancient ancestor, right? So the nation of Israel, right, is named after Israel. Is named after Israel, Jacob, right, who was called Israel, and so that will be a patronym, okay. And so likewise, in the Genesis genealogy in chapter 10, when it named Egypt or Assyria or the Sidon, right, the Sidon, so what they are trying to say is that there is someone from whom this group of people who are living in the land of Egypt or is Assyria or Sidon, they come from this guy. Okay, so that is what the text is trying to convey. Okay, so for example, the use of the name Sidon may just mean an ancient ancestor of the Sidonians. Okay, I think, is that clear? Is that enough?
Yeah. So actually, could you just state that one more time just to make sure I got it and the audience got it?
Okay. Oh, to repeat again? Or...
Not the whole thing, just what does patronymic mean? Like, well, I guess more specifically, how does that work with the text? So are you saying that Egypt and Assyria, that it was actually named by a specific person?
Yeah, so that's right. There are persons, right, who are named Egypt and Assyria, right? And Walton would say that these are real persons, just like Israel was a real person, right? Israel is Jacob, isn't it? Right, in Genesis, right? He was called Israel, and so there are real persons from whom this the group of people who live in the land of Egypt or Assyria, they came from these persons, and therefore the point here is that when we find these names in the list, they are trying to refer to real persons.
Yeah. Okay. And so basically what you're saying is that, hey, we don't have any scientific or even archaeological evidence that necessarily contradict this. So it doesn't really contradict with anything, correct?
Yeah, there's no scientific evidence that contradict what I just said. And in fact, if you think about genealogical ancestry, right, I think it is quite plausible too. I mean, we don't have to claim that all Egyptians descended from one guy, right? I mean, that's not what I need to claim. But all we need to say is that no, there is one person who is the genealogical ancestors, right, of others, but even though he may not be the only ancestor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what's the problem? I don't see any problem.
Yeah, that doesn't necessarily contradict with any scientific or
Not at
archaeological.
all. Yeah.
Maybe it might seem silly today, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's wrong.
Yeah.
So we don't have any necessarily reason to reject that. Next, Spark says, let's see. Well, maybe that's not written correctly. Okay, so you wrote this in the. I'll try to read this, and you tell me if it makes any sense. All right. So Sparks replies to my objections, by arguing that the biblical authors knew nothing about a distinction between image-bearing and non-image-bearing humans. So this is you talking. So he doesn't. He doesn't. He's saying that the authors didn't know anything about this distinction here, and they also didn't know anything about genetic and genealogical identities. So basically, he's like, hey, the authors didn't know anything about this, so it would be wrong to say that this is what the authors are teaching. Could you talk about that before we go on to the next one?
Yeah. So I think Sparks' objection is based on the confusion between task A and task C, right? So as I said earlier on, when we talk about task C, when we construct a possible model, we can refer to things that the biblical authors may not be aware of, right? As I said earlier, as I already explained earlier on, because God didn't reveal everything, right, to the biblical authors. Now, when it comes to task A, I would agree that the authors of Genesis and Paul would say that Adam and Eve are the first parents of all human beings, right? So my model actually do agree with what Sparks is saying, right? But Sparks think that the distinction, right, between the genealogy and the genealogical distinction between image bearing and non-image bearing, this distinction is not found in the text. Well, but as I said, that distinction is used for task C, not task A. So what's the problem, right? Yeah.
Okay. Continuing that in that case, so let's see. Yes, and then he also says if we could ask the author of Genesis or the Apostle Paul who were the first parents of all human beings, I'm sure they would quite say they were Adam and Eve.
I would say the same thing too. My model also said the same thing, right? Because on my model, all human beings are descendants of Adam. Yeah. But that doesn't exclude that they could be anatomical homo outside the garden, right? Who are and those are not human beings on my model, isn't it?
Okay. Keep on.
So I think Sparks' problem is that he is assuming that anatomical homo are human beings, right? I think that's he's assuming, but then if he assumes that, then he's begging the question against my model.
I see. So, and just for the audience sake, so you have the image of God, human beings, and then you have the anatomical, which is like the physical, human, but not really human, because human is defined differently in this conversation. So you
that's right.
Yeah, keep on.
And different scientists have different definition of human beings too, right? I mentioned that there's some scientists define it behaviorally, some scientists define it anatomically, right? So even in science, right, there is, and philosophy, right, there are different definitions of humans, and so my point is that on my model, I'm following the biblical data, right? I define human beings as those who possess the image of God, and so but we shouldn't assume that the anatomical homo in the distant past, right? That they are also, that all of them possess the image of God, right? That is unproven, and that will be something that Sparks will be bringing into the text, right? When the text that doesn't actually say or exclude this possibility.
Yeah, I see. And on a similar note, so William Lane Craig, he claims that Genesis does not permit a distinction between anatomical homo and image-bearing homo, stating that to be human, just to be as in the image of God. So he's thinking like, hey, Genesis 1, day 6, when it talks about the Adam, the humanity was made in the image of God, that's just referring to everybody. When he's saying that appears to be a problem with your view, because you're saying, hey, that's not actually everybody. That is just a specific type of homo. So could you explain what you think Craig is arguing and why you don't think that's an issue for your view?
Yeah, so I think Craig is making the same mistake as Sparks. Okay, both of them are assuming that human includes all anatomical homo. But this actually begs the question against my view, because on my view, that's not the case, right? Now, I do agree that in Genesis 1, it is the image of God that distinguished man from animals. However, this does not imply that man equals anatomical homo, right? So the Bible doesn't. Now, of course, the Bible doesn't talk about all these distinctions, as I said earlier on, right? But then again, the Bible doesn't exclude these distinctions either. Okay, the Bible's focus is on the Bible is written for the ancient Jews, right? Genesis is written to the ancient Jews, and of course, for the ancient Jews, right, they wouldn't know about evolution or right these distinctions, because that would not be something that they'll be concerned about, right?
Yeah.
So so the Bible, it does, and that's the reason why the Bible doesn't talk about all these distinctions, right? But having said that, the Bible doesn't exclude these distinctions either. Okay, so given the possibility of this distinction, we shouldn't. The Craig's objection will be begging the question against the possibility, right? So and I think that's why his objection fails, because it begs the question.
Yeah, yeah. So maybe if I
And by
could
the
put
way,
it.
by the way, let me also highlight one more point,
Okay.
which is Craig himself also makes a distinction, okay, in his own model. Okay, why? Because remember, on Craig's model, Homo heidelbergensis, the first God's image bearer was a Homo heidelbergensis, right? But then there are already anatomical Homo who existed earlier than Homo heidelbergensis. Remember the Homo erectus. Homo erectus actually existed before Homo heidelbergensis came along, right? So on his view, the Homo erectus, which is anatomical Homo, those were not humans, right? Because those had not attained the capacity for abstract thinking, right? Homo erectus didn't have those capacities. And so on Craig's own model, those anatomical Homo will not be humans. So what this implies is that Craig himself also draws a distinction between anatomical Homo and human beings who bear the image of God. You see my point?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that maybe I guess where people get stuck at is like if you don't think about science in any typical way and you just think the Genesis text, and specifically because that's not what the ancient Israelite or Moses or whoever wrote Genesis was thinking about. They were not thinking about science when they wrote this, and they were also writing for an audience that it's basically like, hey, you're not going to write a text that everyone else is going to get confused about. Essentially, what they're kind of essentially saying is like, hey, when I read, let us make man in our image, in the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them. When I see that, not thinking about the whole science discussion, I'm thinking, okay, this word Adam, that means humanity, and I see no reason to make this distinction, and therefore, it seems to me that if you don't bring science into this discussion, it seems that these are referring to all people that would even look like a human in general. Like, of course, they didn't have these like humanity distinctions between Homo or Neanderthals or anything like that. They're just thinking of anybody that looks like me or you, and that seems to be at least if we don't take science into the equation, that seems to be what they're saying. That's what their argument, at least. So, what about the whole situation makes you think, okay, that's maybe not how we should look at it?
Yeah, good question. So now one important response which I want to make is that when we talk about biblical inerrancy, we are referring to what the text, what the author is trying to affirm in the text.
Yeah.
And this should be distinguished from the author's beliefs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to illustrate this point using another issue. So for example, there are biblical texts that talks about the sun rises right from one end to the other, and then from one end and cross the sky and drop down to the other end, right? In Psalm 19 verse 6, for example. Now, so this text, of course, was a huge text like this, right? Was controversial during the Galileo incident, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and since then, many biblical scholars would argue that, well, the text should be understood phenomenologically, right? It's not telling us literally that the sun rises from one end to the other end, but the text is actually affirming a phenomenology, how this appears to people. Okay. Now, I think that is true. However, I also think that it is also true. I think that the ancient Jewish authors who wrote the Psalms, who wrote this verse, I think that they do believe that the sun rises, right? Because this was before Galileo, right? So the authors themselves may have believed something which is contrary to science, but what they affirm in the text, right, is that they are trying to talk about the phenomenology. Okay, so we should distinguish, right, between what the author is trying to say using the text, and the beliefs of the author, the other beliefs of the author. Because the authors have many other beliefs, right, which he didn't affirm in the text, but he may hold these beliefs in other regards. So now back to the Genesis question. I would agree that the authors of Genesis, Moses, or no, save Moses. Okay, so I think that he doesn't know about evolution, and he may well have believed that all the anatomical homo that he see, or anybody who looks like one, would be a human being, right? But what he affirmed in the text, is that a human is somebody who is created in the image of God. That is what the text affirms. And so when we talk about inerrancy, we should focus on what the text affirms, and that is what the text affirms. And my model agrees with that. And given this affirmation, it doesn't exclude that there could be other creatures who look like us, but who may not physically, that is, but who may not bear the image of God, right? So even though that may not be what Moses believed or whatever, right? But still, it doesn't contradict what the text affirms, because the text is focusing on the image of God. That's what the text focuses on.
Right. So you have this idea of inspiration, where the Bible is inspired and what is teaching, not necessarily everything that the author thought while they were writing about it. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for that. All right. So Dr. Kip Davis, who's a scholar in Dead Sea Scrolls, he, and also the Hebrew Bible as well, but he had an interesting question. So he says, how do beings outside the garden fit into this picture of Genesis 2? It says Yahweh God formed all the animals from the earth and brought them to Adam. So, it seems like all animals were brought to Adam. How does that interact with the beings that are outside the garden?
Okay, interesting question. Yeah. So beings outside the garden. Okay, so when God formed animals, he brought them to Adam. Could he have brought some anatomical homo? Right. So that's an interesting question. Could he have brought some? Would they be brought in as well, and Adam would name them, right? And so now, of course, the text is silent on all these issues, right? And so again, when we interpret the text, we need to understand what is the text trying to affirm in a way that is understandable, right, to the ancient readers. So as I said just now, the ancient readers, I don't think they are thinking about evolution, right? I think when they think about animals, they are thinking about the beasts of the field, right? The cattle, right? Or the lions that they saw occasionally. And so so when the text says that God bring these animals, right, to Adam, I don't think that it necessarily have to include all the creatures that ever existed, right? And I don't think that God would need to bring dinosaurs, right, to them as well. But rather, I think that the reference is more specific. So those in the garden, those are which are relevant to Adam, right? Now, of course, the text also doesn't say a lot about what these are. But we know that there are some animals in the garden. Now, are there dinosaurs in the garden? The Bible doesn't talk about that, right? So what I'm saying is that that text doesn't have to be understood as saying that all the creatures which ever existed were brought to Adam. But I think the focus is on those creatures which are known and relevant, right, to the ancient Jewish readers. Yeah.
I see. All right. So one other interesting question that was brought up in the book was, wouldn't it be morally repugnant to form humans, image bearers, to interbreed with non-image bearing members of Homo?
Yeah, thank you for your question. So this is a question that I address at length in my book. The Origin of Humanity and Evolution, right? Not the Four Views book, but the other, I've written a whole book on this topic.
Yeah.
And so I have two responses to this. One is that, I mean, there are two possibilities. One possibility that it is repugnant, and Adam's descendants, which include Cain, right, who killed Abel and left the group, right, and he got his wife. So who is his wife? Right? He could have got it from an anatomical Homo, non-image bearing, and have sex with her and got descendants with her. In a way that is repugnant and which is in disobedience to the will of God, right? So so that's one possibility, right? So it may be more, if it's more repugnant, then it could have been done in disobedience to God. God didn't command them to do it, but some of them, like Cain, for example, that could have done it, right? So that's one possibility. Now, another possibility is to argue that it is not morally repugnant because those anatomical Homo, they share the same physical body as those which bear God's image, right? Anatomically, they are the same. And so this shouldn't be considered as bestiality, right, in a sense. Why? Because if you read what the Bible says about bestiality, now, of course, the Bible condemns bestiality, right? But bestiality is condemned because it is lusting after other flesh, other kinds of flesh, as Jude put it, right? But if somebody mated with an anatomical Homo, then that is not actually lusting after other flesh because they are the same when it comes to flesh, right? It's just they are different just because of their moral, spiritual capacities. One has the image of God, the other doesn't. But when it comes to flesh, they are of the same flesh, and so so it might be the case that it is not repugnant. It may not be in disobedience to God in that sense. Okay, and so now of course, and so I think both possibilities are defensible. And I don't think we can know very clearly what the right answer is because the Bible doesn't talk about this, right? And the reason why the Bible doesn't talk about this in such details is because, as I said just now, the Bible is not written to people who are thinking about anatomical Homo or anatomical Homo without the image of God, right? Or these things, right? So, and so the Bible doesn't talk about this in great details. But based on what the Bible does say, it seems to me that there's either possibility is compatible with what the Bible says. So if for some reasons you think that it is repugnant, then you can go for the first possibility, which I explained just now. Yeah.
Much appreciated. All right. So next thing here. So let's discuss. Yeah. All right. Here's a good one. So Marcus Ross, he objects that the 7 declarations of good and very good in Genesis 1 are absurd if God built judgment and frustration into the world from its beginning. This culminates in Loke's argument that a gap could exist between the events in Genesis 1 to 2 and the ostensible initiation of creation week in verse 3. What do you think about all that?
Okay, you're skipping a few questions, is that right?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, that's right. So I'm a bit lost in my notes here. Okay, so can you repeat a question again? Which one are you now?
So it's Ross objects that the 7 declarations of good and very good in Genesis 1 are absurd if God built judgment and frustration into the world from the very beginning. The typical God says that the creation is good, but that obviously doesn't make sense if there's judgment and death and all this other stuff into the world from the very beginning. And that what you mentioned Genesis 1 to 2. And it seems that Marcus is saying, hey, it seems like there's some type of gap there under Loke's view, and somehow that makes it okay. Could you talk about the conversation?
Yeah, so I mentioned in my reply that the same description very good, right? Toet
Mm.
mewut in the Hebrew. This is also used in the land of Palestine in Numbers. This is also used to refer to the land of Palestine. Very good in Numbers chapter 14, verse 7. Even though that land is not perfect, right? That land is filled with enemies of the Jews and also wicked people there. And there's also death of animals and plants already there in that
Mm.
land too. Okay, so what this means is that the phrase very good doesn't mean perfect. It doesn't exclude death, right? Um, so yeah, so I don't think Ross' conclusion follows. No, so we have to be right. And the other way to respond to this is to say that yeah, the other possibility is to say that yes, very good, but that may just be referring to the state within the Garden of Eden, right? Because the focus of the text is referring to the human world, and humans
Mm.
are referring to the image bearers inside the garden. So that world could be perfect in the sense that there's no death in that world in the Eden, but that doesn't exclude that doesn't exclude the possibility that there could be death outside the garden or before the garden was set up, right? It doesn't exclude that. Yeah. So these are two possible these are two responses to Ross.
Appreciate that. Okay. So going back a little bit, sorry about the lack of order here. So Marcus Ross responded to you saying Loke seeks to justify
Yeah.
gap theory-esque judgment by reading the context of Jeremiah 4:23 to 31 backward into Genesis 1 to 2. However, Jeremiah is describing Judah's destruction as a reversal of creation. His prophecy is neither a recapitulation nor a commentary talking about Genesis 1 2. In Loke's parallel claim that the groaning and frustration of Romans 8:18 to 25 can be located in Genesis 1 to 2 lacks support because it's not a commentary on it. But what he's saying is Romans 8, talks about the groanings of creation. That he's saying that's not a commentary on Genesis 1 to 2, so you can't say that that's about Genesis 1 to 2. And then he's like, it's clearly about Genesis 3. So could you talk about your thoughts on those two passages there?
Yeah, thank you. So this is an important issue because it concerns the interpretation of Romans chapter 8,
Uh,
verses 18 to 25, right? Where it talks about the groaning of creation. And the young creationists will want to argue that the groaning of creation is the result of Adam's sin in Genesis chapter 3.
mm-hmm.
Okay. So they think that before Adam's sin, creation was not groaning. There was no death in all of creation. The lions were, not eating meat originally. All the lions were vegetarians. But after Adam sinned, then the lions become carnivores, and they were eating meat and causing death, and so death began to happen. All this. So that is how the young creation is, right? That is how they think about animal suffering and groaning of creation, right, in Romans chapter 8. Now, in my book, I offer a different view. I argue that Romans chapter 8, the groaning of creation, is not the result of Adam's sin, but rather, I argue that in Genesis 1, verse 2, it already indicates that there was already some indication of imperfection which was present even before Adam sinned, right? Genesis chapter 1, verse 2 is talking about the earth was formless and void. And that was the state of the earth before the Garden of Eden was set up and before Adam was created, right? So this was before Adam sinned. There was already tohu wabahu, formless and void. And so I noted that some biblical scholars have pointed out a very interesting connection between the tohu wabahu, formless and void, in Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, and Jeremiah chapter 4, which also use the same phrase, right? Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 23 to 31. And so now I would think that Jeremiah is describing a kind of reversal of creation when it talks about Judah's destruction. Right? In Jeremiah chapter 4, it talks about Judah's destruction. So it's like if the land becomes, the state becomes formless and void. And so it is kind of reversal of creation. It's a reversal to the state of Genesis 1 verse 2, where the same Hebrew words formless and void, tohu wabahu, was used. Now, Marcus Ross, he failed to note my point that the Jeremiah passage not only talks about tohu wabahu, but it also talks about groaning too. You find that the groaning is also mentioned in the context of Jeremiah. And so this is very interesting because it shows that it seems to connect Genesis chapter 1 verse 2 and also Romans chapter 8. And so this provides some kind of support for locating Romans chapter 8 verse 18 to 25, which talks about groaning, right, to Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. Okay, which was my point, right? So I find these connections very interesting. And it's also interesting to note that Jeremiah chapter 4 verse 23 is talking about it refers to the earth and the heavens. And so it is more relevant to both Romans chapter 8 and Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, right? Because Romans chapter 8 is talking about the whole of creation, right? The heavens and the earth. And Genesis 1, 2 is also talking about something that, saying that the earth was formless and void, right? So it's talking about something that is of a much greater scope. Contrast this with Marcus Ross' reading of Romans chapter 8, when he says that the groaning, right? He says this is referring to the pain of the woman in labor in Genesis chapter 3. Okay? Now, I think the problem is that in Genesis chapter 3, when it talks about the groaning, it is literally referring to the woman, right? It's not talking about the whole of creation, right? Which Romans chapter 8 is talking about, right? So I think that is a problem for his view. Now, moreover, Richard Bauckham, eminent biblical scholar, he has observed that a reference to Genesis 3, where God curses the ground because of Adam's sin, with the result that farming, for example, will be harder work in Genesis chapter 3, verse 17. This does not seem to be an adequate basis for Paul's claim that the whole of creation is in bondage to decay, groaning and trivial, right? Because Genesis chapter 3, right, when it refers to the cursing, it is talking about reference to humans, that the creation, the ground will be much harder to work on. It's not talking about the whole of creation suffering or groaning, right? So I find Marcus Ross' interpretation problematic, therefore, right? That because he seems to extrapolate too much. The text doesn't support this interpretation, as Bauckham points out. And moreover, Adam was nowhere mentioned in Romans chapter 8. Adam was mentioned in Romans chapter 5, but not in chapter 8, right? And as I said just now, the curse of Genesis chapter 3 is upon the fruitfulness of the ground, which does not appear to represent the entire living non-human creation, right? But only a specific part of it, the soil of the earth, right? Only a part of creation, not the whole of creation, right? And therefore, it doesn't support Ross' interpretation that Genesis 3 curse was what causing the whole of creation, right, to be groaning, as indicated in Romans chapter 8. So I think the problem is that the young earth creationists, they are reading too much into the text, right? And I think, and we can see this also in another passage which Ross cited. Now, Ross referred to God cursing the serpent, okay, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 14. And then Ross says, so it's not only the ground that is cursed, right? But all animals are cursed too. Why? Because when God cursed the serpent, God says, curse you above all other creatures, above all other creatures, right? So he interpret the Hebrew mikol, right, as all other. So he interpret this as saying that, okay, all other. Now, actually, what the text says is the animals, right? It doesn't talk about those creatures in the sea or the ocean. So even then, it doesn't include all the living things, right? But the other problem is that Marcus Ross is trying to say that, okay, because above all, or more above all, means that all others are cursed as well, right? That is how you interpret it. Okay, so but this is a misinterpretation. Why? Because as Gordon Wenham pointed out, this verse in Genesis chapter 3, verse 14, it doesn't imply that all other animals are also cursed. Why? Because when we read Genesis chapter 3, verse 1, it says that the serpent was more crafty than other wild animals that the Lord God has made. The same Hebrew words, mikol, was used. More than, right? You translate as more than. But more than doesn't mean that others were also crafty too, right? So it doesn't mean that the a cockroach or rodents, they were also crafty, right? He's not saying that, but rather it's just for highlighting, right? That's the character of the snake. So likewise, when the snake was cursed, it was highlighting that he was cursed in the sense that he will be eating the dust of the ground, which is a symbol for defeat, right? He'll be defeated, But it's not saying that all other creatures, including the fish or in the sea, were all cursed as the result of the serpent's sin, right? And so given all these points, I think that Ross' conclusion that the whole creation groaning is all the result of Genesis chapter 3, I think that is unwarranted, right? He is reading too much into the text and drawing unwarranted conclusions. Yeah.
So, and just for clarity there, do you think that Romans 8 is referring to, like Paul is referring, the groaning and all that stuff is referring to Genesis 1-2?
So as I said just now, I think that Jeremiah chapter 4 provides some indication that it is, because I think Paul will be familiar with the Old Testament text. And and Jeremiah is very interesting, right? Because he also mentioned groaning, and he also mentioned tohu walahu, right? Which is connecting with Genesis 1, right? But having said that, I don't think I need to prove this. As I said just now, I think that the burden of proof is on Marcus Ross, right? Because he is the one who wants to claim that evolution is incompatible with the Bible, and so I think he would need to bear the burden of proof, right, to show that the Bible excludes suffering before human sin. So and he tried to bear the burden by, as I said, right, referring to, the groaning of the woman and the serpent being cursed. But I think all these are very, very terrible arguments. They are very weak arguments. They don't prove anything that he's trying to prove, right? So, so I think that he has failed to bear the burden of proof, right? And so I think he has failed to exclude the possible model which I'm offering.
Right. So I guess in your case, so there could be a number of different explanations for what Romans 8 is referring to, but even it doesn't make sense to refer to Genesis 3 there. And lots of other scholars have argued that it's referring to maybe like what the humans are doing in Jeremiah 4 or Hosea or Isaiah. There's all kinds of different texts that refer to this, like these mourning of the earth due to human sin. And I did a video on that, so maybe I'll put that in the description. So let's see here. What else do we have? All right. Here's a fun one. So Marcus Ross mentions John Day's commentary on Genesis 1, 1-5, who says Day's arguments include near universal historical agreement on verses 1-5 as the first day. First 1 as an independent clause as opposed to a temporal clause. So basically, independent clause, in the beginning God created, compared to a dependent clause, which is when God began to create, as the first act of creation. So near universal agreement that Genesis 1:1, that's referring to the first act of creation. And then there's a pattern of darkness, which is verse 2, before there's light, matching the order of events of evening and morning on the first day. Near historical agreement. Could you talk about what you think about that?
Yeah, thank you. So this is this is an objection that Marcus Ross raised in his final rejoinder, right, to the other participants. And I didn't have the opportunity to respond to him in the book itself because this was written after we have already submitted our response, right? And we don't have any space to respond to their rejoinder, right? And therefore I didn't have the opportunity to respond to him in the book itself, and I only respond to him in the academia.edu document, which I'm sure you will put in the link, right, into this description of this video as well. Yeah. Okay. So so in my response in that document, I pointed out that there are a number of problems with Ross' citation of John Day's argument here, and the first problem, the first issue is that now it's interesting to note that my model also doesn't require rejecting Day's interpretation that verses 1 to 5 is referring to first day. I mean, that is the main point that Day is emphasizing here, and Ross is citing him for this point. Why? Because now remember, just now, as I said at the beginning of this video, I'm using John Collins' interpretation, right? John Collins' interpretation of Genesis 1. And I mentioned at the beginning that John Collins' interpretation actually has two important aspects. One is that John Collins thinks that the Genesis chapter 1 doesn't exclude a gap between verse 1 and verse 2. Okay. But he also but there's a second aspect, which is that he thinks that the 7 days can be interpreted analogically. It can be analogous for a longer duration of time, right? So there are these two important aspects. Now, John Day's argument, which Marcus Ross is citing here, even if it is successful, it only excludes a gap between verse 1 and verse 2, right? To say that it's all, verse 1 to verse 5 is all day 1, right? That is Day's argument. And so it only excludes the gap interpretation. But it doesn't exclude the second aspect of John Collins' interpretation, which is the analogical day view, right? So what I'm saying is that even if I agree with Day here, right, that verse 1 to verse 5 is talking about the first day, it could still be that this day is an analogical day, which could be analogous for a longer duration of time. And therefore, even if John Day is right, it still doesn't prove young earth creationism, right? Because it doesn't exclude the analogical day view. Okay, so yeah, so this is a caveat I want to say at the beginning before I respond. Okay. So my caveat is that Marcus Ross' point here again, it doesn't affect my model, right?
Yeah.
It's inconsequential. It doesn't.
So before you continue there, could you actually address so when you say analogous, you're not talking about like Hugh Ross, thousands of years each day, right?
Yeah. So John Collins' view is a bit different from Hugh Ross, right? Because Hugh Ross, his view is that he thinks Hugh Ross argues that the Hebrew word yom doesn't have to be referred to 24-hour day, and of course Hugh Ross stretch it to mean a long duration of time, right? And Hugh Ross has been accused of concordism, right? Of reading modern science into the Bible, right? Whereas John Collins' view is not guilty of concordism. Why? Because John Collins thinks that Yom is a 24-hour day, but it is used in an analogous way to be an analogy, right, for an undefined longer duration. And Hugh argue, and John Collins argue for this point based on careful study of the grammar and also the context. So, for example, John Collins pointed out that day 7, it has no evening and morning, right? There's no mention of evening and morning for day 7. Now, evening and morning was used as an indicator of the beginning and the closure of a duration. But this formula was missing for day 7. So what this indicates is that it seems that day 7 is being used in an analogous way to say that it hasn't actually ended, right? Which means that it could be analogous for a longer duration of time. Which hasn't ended yet. And obviously, God also doesn't literally get tired, right? When it says God rested, it's not saying that God literally got tired. And so so John Collins, he finds all this indication which suggests that this description is being used in an analogous way. And so the main purpose of the 6 days of creation, 1 day of rest, is to set a pattern, right, for the human work week. And so it is analogous. So the creation days is analogous to a human work week, but it doesn't require a literal identification of 1 day is equivalent to 1 day, right? It doesn't require that because it could be analogous. So that is John Collins' argument, and and it's a bit different from Hugh Ross. Yeah.
Okay. So not making like very strict literal
Mm.
chronological claims of this was created, then this was created. Gotcha. All right. So uh, so you didn't actually necessarily respond completely, so you can keep going without with
Okay,
the rest
sure.
of that response there.
Yeah. All right. Yeah. So I have. Okay. So let me now go on to respond to John Day's interpretation. Now, as I said, my model doesn't require a rejection of his interpretation, right? So even if he's right, it doesn't refute my model. But nevertheless, I do think that there are some problems with his arguments when he tried to argue that the first day is from verse 1 to verse 5, right?
Mm,
That's what he's trying to argue. Now, uh, first of all, no, he claims that this is the near universal historical agreement, right? Um, now, I do think that when we look at reception history, it's important to consider reception history, right? How do people have read this in the past? But however, I do not think that this is the only consideration, right?
mm,
So we also need to consider other factors like the context, the genre, because sometimes the people may have misread it in the past too, right? I mean, yeah. Um, so we need to consider other things, not just reception history. Now, when we consider other things, we find that, no, by the way, John Day also, now actually Marcus Ross failed to note John Day's qualification that John Day, he says, he is arguing contrary to the current general consensus among biblical scholars, which is what this means is that no, John Day, what John Day is saying is that yes, this was the historically, almost everybody agree, but nowadays
mm,
most biblical scholars disagree, right, with his interpretation.
yeah.
Okay, so he's actually arguing against the scholarly consensus nowadays. Okay, um, and I think this is also something that we need to take note because we need to ask, so why is it that most scholars nowadays disagree, right, with the historical consensus? Right, so the consensus has shifted, right? So because there should be some reason for this, and John Day is actually arguing against these scholarly views nowadays.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is um, something to note. And so when we go into the details of the exegesis, we find that there are a number of problems. The first is that um, now, first of all, John Day argued that verse 1 is an independent clause, okay, as opposed to a temporal clause. Now, in fact, John Collins agreed with that. So that's not a problem, right, for John Collins' interpretation. Now, the main issue here, which is about the darkness in Genesis 1 verse 2. Now, John Day, he thinks that this darkness in Genesis 1 verse 2 represent the first part of the first day. And that's why he thinks that there's no gap. Right? He thinks that this excludes a gap, no, because Genesis 1 verse 2 says darkness, and this darkness was actually the evening, which then became the morning, right, later on. So all this is actually part of the first day, from verse 1 to verse 5. All this is part of
Mm,
the first day. Now, however, I don't think I think that this argument is a non sequitur. I don't think the conclusion follows from the observation. Why? Because the darkness before the light fits John Collins' view as well. Why? Because John Collins, he regarded verse 2 as setting the background condition for verse 3. So on Collins' view, day 1 only begin on verse 3, not verse 1, right? In verse 3, but not in verse 1. So um, now obviously there wasn't already light at the place when God said, let there be light. Otherwise, God wouldn't have need to say that there be light. So what that means is that at the start of um, the first day, there was darkness, right? There was still darkness at the beginning of day 1.
mm,
Okay, but this does not mean that the darkness represent no, but this does not exclude Collins' view. Why? Because the darkness could have already pre-existed the beginning of day 1, and then extending into the beginning of day 1, at which point God says, let there be light, and then there was light. Okay, so um, and therefore a time gap between verse 1 and verse 2 is still not excluded. Okay, because verse 2 could be understood as the background condition for verse 3, which is where day one starts on Collins' view.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Is
Yeah.
that clear?
Oh, yeah, makes total sense. Yeah.
Hmm.
So what you're saying is essentially, hey, yeah, there's like, a gap in time, not necessarily that you're talking about like the gap theory that people argued, but uh, uh,
Yeah. My
some
view is that I'm not claiming that there is a gap. Rather, what I'm cl- claiming is that it doesn't exclude a gap.
I see. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, this is a very subtle point, right? And this is the point that John Collins made himself, right? John Collins also make it clear that he is not arguing that there is a gap. He's not claiming that there must be a gap. Rather, he's saying that the text does not exclude the gap.
Mhm.
Mhm.
All right, and so yeah. Anyway, so essentially there doesn't exclude a gap between Genesis 1 and 2. Genesis 1 2 is the background information, and then Genesis 1 3 is referred to just when the
Yeah.
light appears.
Mm.
So there's not so on that view, Collins would still say that 1 to 5 is not just the first day, right?
Yes, that's right. For
Right.
John Collins, day one starts in verse 3.
Yep. Right. Right.
Okay.
Right.
And he argued for this on a number of independent grammatical considerations. So if you read John Collins' book, Reading Genesis Well,
Yep.
you'll find that he provided a number of arguments for his view, including his consideration of discourse grammar. Now, of course, we don't have time to talk about this. I encourage readers to read his book. But one point I want to highlight is that John Day, he didn't respond to John Collins' argument. He didn't consider John Collins' argument for why John Collins think that day one actually starts in verse 3 and not verse 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. All right.
So
So
therefore, I
next,
think that I think that John Collins' view remain unrefuted. Yeah.
I see. Ross, he also argues, furthermore, Exodus 20:11 clearly affirms that all of God's creation activities occur within the 6 days. Specifically, its use of the heavens and the earth is a reference to Genesis 1:1, not verse 3. So I'll pull up that here. But what do you think about that argument?
Yeah, that's right. So John Collins himself has already responded to this point.
Uh-huh.
He replies by saying that concerning Exodus chapter 20, we need to note the verb that is used in this phrase. Right? It is not bara, it's
Right.
asa. Okay, so asa can be understood as similar to yasa. Just now we mentioned it's a kind of shaping, right, of physical reality. So rather than the initial creation, bara. So what Collins is arguing is that Exodus chapter verse 20:11 is talking about God shaping reality, right, to provide in such a way that it end
Mm-hmm.
up resulting in a super environment for human beings to live, to love, and to serve. Okay, so this and so Exodus chapter 20 verse 11 is not talking about the origin of the cosmos, but rather the 7 days of shaping
Mm-hmm.
reality, and that is consistent with Collins' view that day one begins um, on verse 3, yeah, and then
Mm-hmm.
followed by day one, and all these days can be understood as analogical day. Yeah,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Exodus 20:11, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that
mm,
is in them, but he rested on
yeah.
the seventh day. All right.
That's right. The
So,
word made, right, is asa,
yep, right. Asa, right. All
not
right.
bara. Yeah. Mm.
Well, thank you for that. All right. And next question here. This is a really interesting one. So Ross argues that if verses 1 to 2 are separated from 3 to 5, if they're not part of that first day, then the first day becomes the only day in which the terms heavens, which is Shemayim in Hebrew, is absent. And what he's saying is this is not credible given the text's numerical interest and parallelisms. And this is something that I asked him specifically
Mm.
in messages with him. He says that the heavens is mentioned in every day except for the first day, and verse 1 to 2 are separated from 3 to 5. The word shows up 11 times in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, which is that essentially that first creation account. If Genesis 1:1 is part of the first day, then heaven shows up one time each on days 1, 2, 3, 5, and 7, and 3 times each on days 4 and 6. Of course, it also then shows up twice in the reflected structure of Genesis 2:4. That structural interest in the heavens would be very strangely disrupted if heavens is mentioned in a creation prior to the first day and not in the first day. So he's like, all these other days have this word, but not Genesis day 1 if you exclude the first two verses, and that just doesn't make sense as the writer is trying to make all these parallelisms. What do you think about that?
Yeah. Okay, the first thing we need to note is that Shemaim, right, the word for heavens, translates as heavens. And this word, when it's used together with the earth, the heavens and the earth, right,
Uh-huh.
is a semantic merism that is used to refer to the entirety of physical reality. But because the ancient Hebrews, they do not have a separate word for universe, right? They don't have a word like cosmos. But when they want to talk about the whole of physical reality, they use heavens and earth, right? They put these two words together, to refer to heavens and earth.
Yeah.
But this does not mean that. But this is a merism, right? Merism means that when you put two words together, they mean something else, right? That is different from these words when they are taken individually. Okay. So it's just like in merism, I think there's a English phrase called sinker and line, sinker and something like hook, line and sinker, right? Hook, line and sinker, right? Like when you put these three words together, it's like referring to the whole of something, right? But when you take this, when you take these words individually, right? They are referring. So when you put these words together, they mean something else, right? Rather than these words are used individually. So so this is an important observation. Why? Because this indicate that when the Bible says at the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, this is referring to the cosmos being created at the beginning, right? It doesn't imply that the earth itself already existed at the beginning, right? And therefore it doesn't contradict the scientific discoveries that okay, so according to modern science, the Big Bang happened 30.8 billion years ago, but the earth only existed 4.6 billion years ago, right? And so it's not at the beginning of the Big Bang, right? The earth, right? So now I'm not using modern science to interpret the Bible, right? I'm not, but rather what I'm saying is that there's no contradiction with modern science. Okay, I'm not using modern science to interpret the Bible, but what I'm saying is that the Genesis text, when we interpret it properly, when we understood what is a merism, we find that there is no conflict with modern science. Okay, so this is the first point. Okay, and therefore what these points also implies is that the heavens, Genesis 1 verse 1, when it says in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth, it is not saying that the heavens, the Shemaim, already existed at the beginning. But rather it's saying that the whole universe existed right at the beginning because God created it. But it's not saying that the heavens itself, the Shemaim, is already existed at the beginning. And this is an important point to note. Why? Because we find that the Shemaim, which also translated as a sky, right? This is only said to have been created in the second day, not the first day, in verse 8. Okay. So when we read Genesis 1, verse 8, it says that the Shemaim was created. So this can also explain why is it that Shemaim is it is used as part of the merism, right, for verse 1, but it is absent from day 1. Okay, why? Because it's only created in day 2, according to the text. So I think Ross failed to read the Bible carefully. He says, well, it'll be strange if the sky is missing from day 1. Well, I don't think it's strange because if you read the text carefully, it says that the sky is only created on day 2, right? It'll be contradiction. It'll be contradictory, right, to the Bible itself if it says about the sky also in day 1 and then it's created in day 2. I think that'll be funny. Okay. So I think Ross' objection is based on the failure to read the Bible carefully.
Yeah, and I would suspect that he would argue that the words for this sky and Hashemayim and Genesis 1:1 are basically are different, referring to different things. So I guess in some ways, yeah. So that would perfectly explain why the word isn't mentioned in day one, because that
Mm.
would make sense with the narrative. At the
Yeah.
same time, there is another way to read, another possibility, uh, uh, but in that way, it essentially just comes down to what you think the text is claiming,
Mm.
not necessarily, I guess parallelisms and stuff like that. But so let's see what else we have here. So Second Peter 3,
Mm.
that's a really fun one. So it
Yeah.
talks about the flood. Could you
Mm.
yeah, could you talk about what your view is specifically? So I'm going to pull up the text, but could you talk about what your view is, what the text is claiming, and then how that doesn't necessarily mean it's referring to a global flood?
Yes. Yeah. So um, to begin, we need to distinguish between three terms here, right? One is global, one is local, and the other term is universal. Okay.
Mm,
So so there has been debate, right, about whether the flood was a global flood or is it a local flood, and then the word universal is used by is used by Marcus Ross, the
mm,
younger creationist, right? He says that, well, it's a universal flood, therefore it's a global flood. Now I think that he is confused. We should distinguish between a global, yeah, we should distinguish between global and universal. Now what I want to say is that, on my view, it is a universal flood in the sense that it is universal for all God image bearers, for destroying all human beings except Noah, right, and his family. Uh, and that is what the text in Second Peter chapter 3, verse 1-7 says. It says that the purpose of the flood is to the function of the flood, right, is to destroy the world of the ungodly. And so it is universal in that sense. Now, to accomplish this purpose, does it have to be global? Well,
mm,
if you think that it has to be global, then you are assuming that human beings at the time of Noah have already spread across the entire globe, right? You have to think that Adam's descendants, the image bearers, have already spread across the entire globe. But Marcus Ross offers no proof of this, right? How he has not proven that all God's image bearers have already spread across the entire globe by the time of Noah. Now, I heard his interview with you, right? Um, which I think you all did a few weeks ago,
yeah.
and he put the burden of proof on me. Right? I think he illicitly shifted the burden of proof. He says Andrew Loke provide no evidence to show that the God's image bearers haven't spread to the entire globe yet. They are all localized in one place.
Mm,
But I think he is making a fallacious argument here, right? Because he is misunderstanding the burden of proof, right? As I said just now, on my view, I'm arguing for possible model. I think the text doesn't say one way or the other, right? But I don't have to bear the burden of proof, right? To prove that they are all localized. Rather, all I need to show is that there is no proof to show that they have already dispersed throughout the whole world, and therefore it doesn't exclude a local flood, right? So
mm,
that is my model. Now, that's my argument, because, as I say, I'm arguing for a possible model. So it is Marcus Ross, the young creationist, who need to bear the burden of proof, right? If he wants to exclude a local flood and argue for a global flood, and that's what they're trying to do, right? And so the burden of proof should be on him, not on me, right? And he has failed to bear the burden because he has failed to show that the image bearers have already spread across the whole world. Okay, and therefore, given that he has failed to prove his case, I don't think that we need to hold to a global flood. I think that all we need to hold is, I think that it is possible, for all we know, that it's just a local flood, right? But which is of sufficient extent to destroy the God's image bearers, and that is the purpose, right, of the flood. And so it is universal in that sense, and it is also consistent with a careful interpretation of the text in light of the genre, the and the ancient Jewish background. Why? Because when we read now, two eminent Old Testament scholars, John Walton and Champer Longman, they have written a book. They have written a book called "The Lost World of the Flood." Okay. Now, in that book, they argue that if we read the text carefully and compare it with other ancient Near Eastern literature, what
mm,
the text is saying is that, no, it is actually the genre of the text, right, is actually using a lot of it's an apocalyptic kind of genre, which use hyperbolic language, right, to make a theological point, right? So it's saying that there's something terribly drastic. It's like almost as if everything is collapsing and all this, but it's using hyperbolic language to describe the kind of end of apocalyptic scenario, right? But it doesn't mean that all the details need to be understood literally, right? Because it's using hyperbolic language, and this also fits with the ancient Jewish emphasis on the function and the phenomenological interpretation, because as John Walton has argued, the ancient Jews were more concerned about function and phenomenology. And as I said just now, we also use, even Marcus Ross himself would also use phenomenological interpretation, right, when it comes to interpreting verses such as the sunrise and sunset, right? Marcus Ross will also interpret those texts as phenomenological, how it appears to human, right? So what I would argue is that it appears to Noah, and that it's like, oh, the whole world is being destroyed. It appears to them that way, but it doesn't mean that literally it's covering the entire globe, right? It doesn't have to be understood that way. So it's a functional, so it's a phenomenological interpretation, and the main function is to achieve the destruction of the ungodly humans, and that doesn't require a global flood if the human beings haven't spread across the whole world yet, right? And Ross has not proven that they have spread across the whole world. Now, Marcus Ross also used another argument in his interview with you. He says that,
before you get into that, I just wanted to mention one thing. So, so just on that burden of proof. So, so I would say that everybody has the burden of proof if they're making a claim. You're making the claim that it's possible. So obviously you have the burden of proof to show it's possible. He's making the burden of that it's a global flood, so he has to show that it's global. So if you're not claiming, hey, it's definitely local, then you're not specifically, you don't have the burden of proof in saying that is a local flood. Is that a good way to put it?
That's right. So the nature of my claim is that is arguing for a possibility, right, rather than actuality. That's the nature of my claim. And so given the nature of my claim, I do not have to provide evidence to prove that it must be local, but all I need to say is that it's possible because that's the nature of my claim, right? So the nature of my claim, given the nature of my claim, all I need to show is that a local flood has not been excluded.
So there, and in other words, like there's ambiguity of the text, and there's no reason to take a specific view. In other words, so 1 Peter 3. So could you talk about that?
Yeah, that's why I want to say something more about this, right? As I said just now, this. Sorry, you mean 1 Peter chapter 2 verse 5? Is that right?
Well, there's 2 Peter 3 was what I was referring to.
Okay.
There's multiple mentions of a flood
that's right.
in Peter, but the one we were mainly talking about in our interview with me and Marcus Ross was 2 Peter 3.
Oh, okay, sorry. Yeah, that's right. Yes. So that verse also relates to the final judgment. I think that was Marcus Ross' point.
Yeah.
And Marcus Ross wants to argue that in order for the final judgment to make sense, right, it's a global judgment, right? And so the flood must be, no, he used the word universal, right? It's a universal judgment, and so the flood must be universal as well. And he interprets universal as global, right? But I think that again, right, this is a fallacious argument, right? Because we need to interpret it carefully. As I said just now, it is universal, but universal is the function, right? It's for the destruction of ungodly people. Now, in the final days, in the second coming, and in fact, I already said just now, when we read Acts chapter 17, verse 31, right? That verse implies that according to the biblical authors, right, the God's image bearers have already spread across the earth, right, by the time of the 1st century AD. And so, given this background, a universal judgment would, at the second coming of Christ in the future, would require a judgment that involves the whole globe, right, the whole earth. But we shouldn't assume that this is the case, that this was the case back at the time of Noah, right? And so, what I'm arguing is that yes, there is universality there, and that's the point of commonality, right? But it doesn't justify his conclusion that therefore the flood must also be global.
Okay, so um, let me try and articulate his view, and just to make sure that we really make it abundantly clear here. So,
Mm,
uh, so so in this passage, it talks about how there's blatant scoffers that they're just like, hey,
mm,
things have stayed the same. Um, you know,
mm,
God, like the creation of the heavens and the earth, there's still the heavens and the earth. It hasn't gone away, and then it seems like Peter, or whoever wrote this, is basically just like, excuse me, no, actually there was the creation, yes, but then there was the flood, and that
mm,
destroyed everything. And so that the scoffers, they're incorrect. It actually did destroy everything, and that's why we can it's reasonable to conclude that, hey, there's going to be a destroying of the world in the future, and it talks about fire and some type of like almost like a melting, burning up, dissolving of the world. um, and there's also maybe this aspect of like, uh, because it was created at one point, it's going to go away or be destroyed at one point. And Marcus he's like, hey, the creation, that's obviously everything. That everything was obviously created, the whole entire everything. And then the flood, well, that's, I guess that's what's up for debate. And then the destroying of everything, well, that's obviously got to be everything. The new heavens and new earth, everything's going to be destroyed. So he's saying like both of those, whether it's the destroying or the creating, that was everything. So it makes sense to say that the flood was absolutely everything. But you're saying that no, it's just referring to the humans. So doesn't that kind of like uh, the, I guess the parallelism that Marcus Ross is arguing? Are you saying that that parallelism is not there? Could you clarify specifically on that point?
Yeah, that's right. When you read the text more carefully, you'll find that obviously it's not saying that everything is entirely parallel, right? Because, okay, in verse 4, it
Okay.
is talking about, okay, sorry, verse 5. Okay, verse 5 talks about the creation of heavens and the earth, right? Long ago, by God's word, the heavens came into being
Mhm.
and the earth was formed, right? And then, so this is referring not only to planet Earth, but also, right, to everything else, the whole of creation. Whereas the flood in verse 6,
Mhm.
it is only affecting, well, it's covering okay, according to young creationists, right, it is covering the whole globe, or according to local, but anyway, it's only affecting the Earth, right? It's not affecting the sky, the universe, the galaxies, or whatever. The
Mhm.
flood doesn't affect the whole of creation, right?
Mhm.
It's only affecting a part of creation, okay?
Mhm.
And then later on in verse 7 is talking about the final judgment. Now, does that affect the whole of creation? Now, again, different theologians have different views about this. But
Mhm.
the basic point is that on all these 3 points, we need to understand what is the purpose, what is the function, why is that, why is the universe created, why is the judgment of the flood, and why is the final judgment coming,
Mhm.
and how does that relate to the scoffers, right? Now, I think Peter's point is that no, these scoffers are saying that, oh, there's no judgment, everything is going to remain the same, and we are going to continue living the same way as we are.
Mhm.
But no, these people are forgetting that actually, there is a. It's not the case that that there's no beginning, no end, right? But there is a definite beginning. God created the heavens and the earth, and then it's not as if human beings have been always been living comfortably and without any fear of judgment. Well, the flood was a judgment, right, for the ungodly humans, and
Mhm.
this was stated, in another Patronymics text, right, we read just now, right, the judgment of the ungodly, and there will be judgment on people too, right, in the final days to come, and so that is the point of commonality. That is the point of parallelism, right? The parallelism is talking with reference to um, people, right? How the people came about, right? God created heavens and earth, and
Mhm.
that's why there could be people around, and people have experienced universal judgment before that wipes out all human beings, those God's image bearers, accept Noah's, and then there will be final judgment coming too for people because of people, right? And so we need to understand at what point is it parallel and at what point is actually not parallel. It's not saying that all the details are parallel, right? As I said just now, obviously the flood didn't affect the whole of creation. Yeah.
I see. Okay. All right. So I just want to make sure I don't miss any of his other arguments or anything towards that point. So just give me 1 second here. Okay, yep, wiping out the godly humans. All right. So there is one aspect here, which is interesting. So I don't know if Ross didn't necessarily make this point, but um, when we look at the text of when the Second Peter was written, they knew about at least some type of globe. So, in other words, like maybe in the time Genesis was written, the people writing, they didn't know about like the whole globe. They might have thought it was some type of like ancient Near Eastern cosmos right there. That, that's a whole up for discussion there. But at least at the time of Second Peter, that it is referring to, or they knew about this whole globe, so that essentially like what they could be referring to is bigger than it was previously because they knew more. There's a good chance that when they refer to like, I'm trying to think here, like that the Earth, they're thinking of a bigger Earth. So when it says like, hey, the Earth is destroyed, then it's talking about the bigger Earth. And so it can't be just a local region, or maybe you disagree with that. So does that change anything of the discussion that they know more and therefore when they talk about like the destruction of the ungodly, that's as like that's the purpose of the flood, that they might be thinking of like a bigger flood than before, maybe even like a global flood. Does that change anything for you?
Well, so as I said just now, the purpose of the flood was to destroy the world of the ungodly, right?
Mm-hmm.
But this does not mean that the ungodly people have already spread across the whole globe. I mean, you may be right to say that by the time of the New Testament, the people maybe may be more aware of how that the world is bigger than what people previously thought, right? But that doesn't mean that therefore during Noah's time, people have already spread across the whole globe, right? It doesn't imply that conclusion.
Okay, yeah. So so I guess in that way, they don't necessarily know. I'm not familiar with any texts that say that they think that humans spread out across the whole globe.
During the
But
time of Noah, right?
during the time of Noah, and he is commenting on Noah. But are you saying that you don't think the writer of Second Peter, that you think that he's putting his mind into what the Genesis writer thinking is thinking when they talk about the flood of Noah? Because wouldn't it make sense that the writer of Second Peter is thinking about like what he thought about the globe, kind of like how a lot of people today when they say, "Oh yeah, Noah's flood," well, must be global because we know the whole world is a globe. Do you see where I'm going with there? I might be a little unclear.
Yeah, I see where you're going. But then again, we also need to read the New Testament writers in context, right? So the author of the so the letters of Peter, right? As I said, when we read, as you noted just now, he mentioned the flood in a few places, right? So he mentioned in 2 Peter chapter 3, but he also mentioned elsewhere about the flood destroying the world of the ungodly. So I think for him, and also for the author of Genesis, the point is the same, right? It's about is focusing on the function, which is with reference to the God image bearers. So I don't think it affects their point about even though they may have different understanding of physical geography of how big the world actually is. So we shouldn't read our views about those things into the text, right? But we should focus on what the text emphasizes, which is on the function.
Yeah, so just for some clarity there, the text doesn't, I kind of might have misquoted a little bit. It does say, being kept for the day of judgment and destruction of the ungodly is actually a reference to the destroying of the heavens and the earth. But I guess you could still say that there is an influence, a idea in the text that the ungodly is in focus.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I don't want to stress that point too much, but yeah, I appreciate you going through that commentary there. So we only have a little bit left here. So let's see here. Yeah. So Ross mentions how you said that the early church commentators saw the ark as a symbol of Christ. So I was a little confused by that to myself. So what was the point of mentioning that the ark as a symbol of Christ, Noah's ark, symbol of Christ? What was the meaning behind that? Why is that relevant to the global and local flood distinction?
Yeah, so when Marcus Ross raised this objection in the book, I think he missed the context of my citation of the early church fathers. Now, the reason why I cited the early church fathers on this point about the symbol, about how the ark symbolized Christ, was actually to answer another objection, right? It was, some people have raised the objection that if the flood was not global, then why didn't God just command the animals, right, to run away to another region outside the flooded region, right? That would have saved them. Why do we need to ask the animals to come into the ark, right? Remember, have you heard about this before? This objection?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, and my reply is that well, the reason why God commanded the animals to come into the ark, right, is rather than run away to some other place, is because the ark was supposed, to be a symbol for Christ. I mean, this is a very traditional Christian view, the view of early church fathers, right? So it's a symbol of Christ that is a symbol of salvation, not only for humans, but for the whole of creation. So this is also related to my interpretation of Colossians chapter 1, verse 20, right? That Christ's redemption, right, is to reconcile all things with God, not only humans. So, so because of this purpose, right, God commanded the animals to come into the ark, right, because the ark was meant to be a symbol. So that was to answer that objection. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So let's see here. Yeah. Yeah. So that wasn't an art that didn't really have anything to do with whether it was local or global, but specifically regarding to why there's a mention of animals. Okay.
That's right.
All right.
Yes.
And could you explain how you think Psalms 104 helps you argue for a local flood?
Yes. This is another passage which is relevant to the whole debate, and I cited this passage as one of the arguments for my local flood view, right? So as I said just now, even though the burden of proof is not on me, I don't have to prove that the flood is local. The burden of proof is on Marcus Ross, right? But having said that, I do think that there is some biblical evidence, there is some biblical reasons to think that the flood was in fact local, right? So here I gave an argument, so which increases the plausibility of my view, right? And what this argument is that Psalm 104 was intended to be a commentary on Genesis, the days of creation. Many biblical scholars have already argued this point. They point out that, say, for example, verse Psalm 104, verse 8, for example, right? It talks about the waters, and and then verse 9, it says that God has set a boundary that the waters cannot cross. Never again will they cover the earth. Okay? So this is understood by many commentators as referring to day 3 of creation, which happens before the flood,
Mm-hmm.
So God already set a boundary for the waters and said that they will not cross this boundary, which means that the flood that happens later on in Genesis chapter 6 to 9, that flood couldn't have been global, right? Because if it's global, then it will imply a crossing of boundaries, right? Which will contradict what God commanded in day 3 of creation. Okay.
Mm.
So that is a biblical, so that's my argument. Now Marcus Ross, he tried to reply to this argument by saying that Psalm 104 is doing double duty. He says that never again will it cross the earth. Well, that is referring to after Noah's flood. So he didn't think that it was all limited to a commentary on Genesis 1 on the days of creation, but
Mm-hmm.
rather he thinks that the biblical author he thinks that Psalm 104 is also bringing in Noah's flood, the consideration of that too. And so he didn't think that is everything is limited to just talking about day 3 of creation. That is his response to my argument.
Mm.
But um, his response ignores the phrase in verse 8, as Kill and Delitzsch, two eminent scholars have observed. Now, Psalm 104 verse 8, it says that the waters ran to a place that God appointed for them. Okay, and this resonates. This is a clear allusion, right? Is clearly alluding to Genesis 1 verse 9. Genesis 1, not Genesis 6. It's talking about the days of creation. Is when God says, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered in one place," right? The place that He has appointed. And so, and also we need to consider Proverbs chapter 8 as well, when it says that when God, so Proverbs chapter 8 verse 27 to 29, it says when God established the heavens, I was there. So the I was referring to wisdom, right? Wisdom was there, and when He drew a circle on the face of the earth, and He made the
Mm-hmm.
firm the skies above, when He established the fountains of the deep, when He assigned the sea its limit, so that the waters might not transgress its command, when He marked out the foundations of the earth.
Mm.
So it's very clear from Proverbs chapter 8, verse 27, 29, that it's talking about creation, right? It's not talking about Noah's flood. So when it says it sets the sea its limit, right? It's and together with Psalm 104, all this is talking about God setting limits for the waters at the creation day 3, right? So given these observations, I think that Marcus Ross' interpretation of the flood as global is actually contrary to the Bible.
Mm. Okay, so just for some clarity, so you mentioned some Hebrew words. Were you referring to your shout made the waters retreat? And of course, that shout would be talking about let the land appear, and so you have this idea of like land appearing, so the waters go down, and um, then later, then as the mountains rose up, the valleys went down to the place you appointed for them. You set up a boundary for them; they could not cross it. They could not cover the earth again. So then that's all that reference to day 3 in your view, correct?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And maybe some clarity, and it's possible I don't understand Marcus's view, but you're saying that it seems like he's saying that verse 9 is doing double duty, that it's referring to the flood and a different text as well.
Yeah, when he says double duty, he's saying that yes, Psalm 104 is commenting on the days of creation, but not limited to that. Not
Yeah.
limited to, yeah, but he is also commenting to what happens afterwards. So double duty in that sense. Yeah.
Hmm.
And what happens afterwards was, he's talking about the flood in Marcus Ross' view. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so then in that case, I would be interested to understand uh, your understanding. So say, under your view, like say it is a local view, a local flood. In that
Mm.
case, how would you understand verse 9? Because if it's referring to day 3 of Genesis 1, then it seems like the flood would be covering the earth. Now, maybe you might say, no, not, it might be referring to the entire earth,
Yeah.
but um, but of course, Marcus Ross mentions how Genesis 1 and Genesis 6, the creation and the flood, they have all these different parallelisms, and the flood is being portrayed as a decreation of what God had done before. So do you agree that the text of the flood is basically a decreation of Genesis 1? And if it is, then uh, then why wouldn't the flood of Genesis 6 be a reference to or the same idea as covering the earth again?
Yeah, good question. So, do I understand it as a decreation? Now, I understand the text, or this text from a functional phenomenological perspective, right? So I think that again, you have to think about the reference to human beings, how they were perceived, right? These
Yeah.
descriptions. So yeah, so my interpretation of Genesis 1 from the functional perspective is, if is a functional phenomenological respect, to the Garden of Eden, which is going to be set up, and that human world, right, which occupy a limited location on Earth, and so the realm of the humans, right, and how we see a land and the water being distinguished during the setting up of that place, and then later there is a reversal of creation, in a sense, in Genesis chapter 6, when the flood comes along and it destroy, the world of the ungodly, right? So, when the waters flooded the place where humans lived again, so there is a decreation in that sense. However, this does not contradict the point that there is some boundaries that is being set up in Genesis 1, right? Um, that's what the text says. Never again will they cross, right, the whole world. So, um, yeah. So I agree. There is creation, there's decreation, but this does not mean that therefore the decreation would require the flood to cross the boundaries that God has set up. So, which means that it couldn't have been a global flood, right? But it must be a decreation in the sense of being functional phenomenologically to humans. So, and this is how we can, put all these texts together and see that, they harmonize, right, in that way.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Does it make
Yeah.
sense?
Yeah. And something that you also mentioned, so I guess this translation doesn't do a good job of it,
Mm.
but um, so 1:8, to the place you appointed for them. So that's that
Yeah.
word al-makom, which is a reference to Genesis 1:9 to 10,
Yes.
correct? Right.
Yeah.
Um, it uses the same word. So it,
Yes.
yeah, so in other words, like it doesn't make sense to say that using the same word if it's referring to the flood.
Yes.
Right. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So what you have here is an inspired Psalm 104
Yeah.
early commentator commenting
Mm.
on Genesis 6. That's really fascinating.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's all the points that we had to talk about. Was there anything else, something that we missed, or something else you wanted to tell our audience?
Okay, I think that's all the points that we need to cover, and I explained, these points in the document in academia.edu, which I'll encourage the audience to take a look, because this document will contain additional information that you don't
Yeah.
find in the Four Views book, right? Because it contains quite a bit of additional arguments, which I offer in response to the rejoinders, that the other three authors have offered, right? So,
Mm,
and I think these additional materials are quite important for the readers to consult, and so as to move the debate forward, right?
yeah.
To arrive at some conclusions. And so my own conclusions is that after looking through at all these arguments, is that no, I think that, in regards to Sparks' view, right? I think that, as I said earlier on, I think that his rejection of Adam on scientific grounds is actually unwarranted. In fact, it has been disproved by the work of scientists like Joshua Swamidass, right, who has argued that modern science doesn't actually exclude the historical Adam, right? So I think Sparks' view is wrong, and his rejection of inerrancy is also unacceptable for us who are evangelicals, and it's also contrary to the reasons which we have offered, the arguments that which we have offered for affirming biblical inerrancy, right? As I said just now, I think that there is good reason to hold to biblical inerrancy, and so I think Sparks' view is wrong. Now, as for Dr. Craig's, as for the young Earth creationist view, right, which is the opposite extreme, right? So Sparks is on one extreme, young Earth creationist is on the other extreme, and me and Dr. Craig, we are somewhere in the middle, right? The other extreme is also wrong, right? Young Earth creationist is also wrong. Why? Because I think that it has huge scientific problems, right? So in the Four Views book, I raised the objection of concerning the evidence, say for example, the evidence from distant starlight, and that indicates that it must have taken billions of years, right, for the light to arrive at the Earth. So this is one important evidence for old universe view, right? But I asked Marcus Ross, but I raised this argument, but Marcus Ross never responded to this, right? He says, "Oh, I don't have space to respond to all these arguments," so he avoided my strongest argument, my strongest scientific argument, right, against a young Earth's view. Okay, so he didn't answer this argument at all, and this argument remains unrefuted, unanswered, right? So I think not only this argument, but there are other arguments against young creationists as well. There are multiple independent arguments, right, from geology, from so from astronomy, from geology, right, from so many different disciplines. Okay, so given all these arguments, I think there's a huge scientific problems with young creationism, and so I think young creationism is false. Now, and another problem with young creationism is that the way that the young creationists have tried to reject other possible interpretations of the text in Genesis and other parts of the Bible is actually based on very bad hermeneutics, as we have already gone through, right? In our discussion today, I pointed out that Marcus Ross, he's reading a lot of assumptions into the text, right? And that is bad interpretation. That is eisegesis, right? And so on the basis of all this bad interpretation of the Bible, the young creationists unwarrantedly exclude other possible and plausible interpretation of the text. And so I think that their view is very is very bad. Okay, so and should be rejected, right? Their arguments should be rejected. Okay, and so so for all these reasons, I think that the other extreme is also wrong. Okay, and then we are left with the two middle positions, right? Which I think most scientifically informed evangelicals would hold as well, right? I think most evangelicals who are well informed about science will not hold to young creationism because that is so implausible, and they will also reject Sparks' view. So it will be between me and Dr. Craig's view, right, in the middle. As I said just now, I think Dr. Craig's view is theologically problematic. The way he didn't take into consideration the image of God. What is it about, right? When he talked about what is the sufficient condition for humanity. And so I think that Dr. Craig's view is problematic as well. And also we didn't have time to talk about this, right? I think his mytho-history interpretation of Genesis is also problematic on exegetical grounds, right? I talked about this in the academia.edu document as well. And so for all these reasons, I think that these other views are problematic, and that's the reason why I think that the view that I have proposed is actually the most likely view. It's not only a possible view, but it's also the most likely and the most plausible too. Yeah, and I think that this view, which I presented, provides a very is a possible and plausible way to reconcile a lot of difficulties that people have, right, about science and the Bible, and remove this obstacle, remove these difficulties. And I think this is tremendously important for evangelism, right? As I shared in my book, and in the Four Views book, right, I mentioned about how some people have come to Christ after understanding that there's no conflict, right, between science and the Bible. So it's tremendously important for evangelism and also for discipleship as well, right? Because I'm very concerned that a lot of young people who grew up in Christian families, they lose their faith, right? Because of all they wrestle with, because they've been taught young earth creationists in their church, and then when they go to university, they study science, they realize that young creationism is actually indefensible, right? And so they lose their faith, and I feel very sad about this. It's a great tragedy, and it's unnecessary, right? So it's very important for us, right, to interpret the Bible properly, right, and to understand science carefully. And when we do that, we will see that actually there's no conflict. And in fact, the discoveries of science has actually helped us to realize, has actually revealed even more evidence to show that there is a creator God, right? And when we study the Bible properly, we find that the Bible is so true, right? What it says has stood the test of time. And so, all this is very important, right, for us Christians. And I hope that all these discussions will help us to understand God's revelation better, and that it will strengthen our faith, help us to share the gospel better, bring more people into God's kingdom, and all this to the glory of God. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for thank you for that explanation, the survey of the different views, and why that's important. Very important topic, and I think somebody actually said that in the chat, like, why is this important? So that explains it really well. Good job there. So I don't want to take too much of your time, but there was one more question I want to talk about. So you kind of did mention the myth of history. So I personally do think that there are some arguments that William Lane Craig made, and I was just like, I don't know why you think this is so strong. But at the same time, I think there's some other arguments that you can make for this myth of history review, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it. So like, if you look at something like the Nuanced, has a lot of parallels with Genesis 1. Doesn't mean it's copied from it, but you get this idea that maybe like it's interacting with it, or the people of the same time period are thinking about the same types of things, therefore they're using same language. Or like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where you've got this, like, you have this flood account in there. You also have someone like Gilgamesh and Enkidu, and there's this conversation about like eternal life, and it's got a lot of parallels with Genesis. Maybe not copying, but a lot of scholars argue it's having the same conversation, like what does it mean to be human, stuff like that. And then you have the myth of Oedipus. All these different texts. A lot of scholars are like said, hey, okay, maybe Genesis 5, that's historical in regards to like it's making historical claims about people that existed, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the stories of Genesis 2 and 3 and like maybe the flood aren't literally like 21st century narrative in that regard. Like someone like John Walton would argue that, like, yes, there's some historical points to this, but all of it isn't completely supposed to be like some 21st century historical account. So what do you think about that? That maybe like parts of these narratives aren't like literally like historical, like maybe there was a tree, but maybe it wasn't exactly like it's described, that kind of idea. What do you think about all that, based off of like the similar, genre comparisons?
Yes, there's a lot to talk about. Okay, so we can go on for another hour, but let me try to be summarize. Try to be very brief here. Now, first of all, there's this issue about the similarities, right? And concerning the similarities, many critical scholars would claim that the Bible actually plagiarized, copied from this other ancient Near Eastern texts, right? And they think that the Enuma Elish and all those texts were actually written earlier, and the Bible was written later, and copied from those. Now, I have never found all these skeptical, critical arguments convincing. I think that these are bad arguments. Why? Because now, first of all, even if the Enuma Elish is written earlier than the Bible, it doesn't mean that the contents of the Enuma Elish dated earlier than the contents that we find in the Bible. Why? Because the Bible could have recorded traditions that were dated even earlier, right? Before they were written down in the Bible, right? So, these traditions could have been going around in oral form, have been shared before they were written down, right? And so, and we must also note, we should also note that when we read the Bible, we find that the biblical account is actually simpler, right, compared to the accounts in Enuma Elish, which has a lot of fanciful details, about the gods are fighting and fighting each other and giving birth to the other, all fanciful details. So Kenneth Kitchen, who is an eminent Old Testament scholar, has argued that the simpler account, right, has a higher probability of being the more ancient one, actually, because you find that these details are being added in later and corrupting the text, right? So I think that there is good reason to think that what we find in the Bible actually dated earlier, right? It could have been shared around earlier in the oral tradition, and of course these traditions were also being spread around, right, to other people in the ancient Near East, and later when it were spread, and when it was spread to the Babylonians, the Sumerians, when these people write down their texts, it became corrupted, right, with all their fanciful details and myths and all this, and so and that's why we find the contents, right, in their in Numa Elish and all this, right, has all these fanciful, all these ridiculous details, and so um, and so I think that those texts are actually corrupted, right, and we have to be careful not to use a corrupted text like the Numa Elish, right, to interpret the Bible. Right? Now, of course, I'm not saying that literature comparison is useless. In fact, I myself have also used some argument just now, right, when I say that we need to consider the genre, you need to do a comparative literature, right? So it is important to compare this literature to understand how the ways of expression, the genre, how do understand how the ancient readers would have read the text. However, we must be very careful not to therefore think that just because some contents, the substance of the contents in one is clearly mythic and corrupted, therefore the Bible is also corrupted. Now that doesn't hold, right? That is not that conclusion doesn't follow. And so when we read the Bible itself, we have to be focused not only on we have to consider not only the genre but also the content, the substance, and how the reception history, right, how it is understood. And as I said just now, the New Testament authors evidently thought that a lot of important details are historical, including Adam and the genealogies, for example. And yeah, so and therefore I think that we should regard those details as historical, including the details about the snake, for example, right? So Revelation, the author of the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, right, when he talks about, he clearly understood the snake as a literal a snake that actually is it represents the devil, right? Satan, the serpent, right? In Revelation chapter 12, right? It refers to the snake as the demon, the devil, right? So this provides reason for thinking that the snake in Genesis 3 is a snake which is able to talk because it was possessed by the demon, right? And of course, many skeptics will say that they would not, they will reject this. They think that they don't believe in demons, all this. But then it's a problem with their worldview, right? I think that their worldview is too narrow, too limited, and given the evidence that we have for biblical revelation, and also given the evidence for demonic possession, which psychiatrists are talking about, right? So there are journal articles talking about evidence for demonic possession. I think that there is good evidence for thinking that the demons exist, and I don't see why they couldn't make a snake talk, right? And John Collins also pointed out that the Bible isn't saying that all animals talk, right? If that is the case, then we would think that that is probably myths, right? But rather, it's only the snake that is mentioned as talking. Okay, and this is the result. We have good reason to think that, and the ancient readers, the authors of Revelation, understood this as the result of Satan, demons, right? It was the representing demon. So given that this is the case, I don't think that we should take the detail of the snake as mythology, like what Dr. Craig thinks. Okay, so I think that we should affirm a literal snake, right? In that is being referred to in Genesis. So this is just one example of how whether we should regard a detail as mythological or not mythological. We have to take into account all these different considerations, right? So that's how we should proceed when we discuss this issue. Yeah, and I find no good reason to hold to Dr. Craig's view. Yeah.
I see. Okay, well, thank you so much for talking about that. I really appreciate that. That was a lot. We could have a whole conversation on that very thing of all the different comparisons and all that. Well, thank you so much for coming on here. It's been a pleasure, and all the information you've given us. It's a long interview, so everybody go check out the book, of course. You can check out my interview with Dr. Marcus Ross. You can check out my video on Romans 8 or the historical Adam and all those fun conversations. But otherwise, you have an entire book that you've written on your view. What was that called?
Yeah, the book is called The Origin of Humanity and Evolution, Science and Scripture in Conversation. And this book is published by T&T Clark in 2022. Yeah, so yeah, I encourage the audience to take a look at this book and also the Four Views book and also the academia.edu document, which contains additional information, which you don't find in the other two books, actually. So, yeah.
Yes, awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Loke. It's been a pleasure, and I do hope you have a good rest of your day.
Yeah, enjoy talking to you. Right.
Thank
See
you.
you, and God bless.